The tow truck driver refused to look me in the eye when I caught him hooking up my Ford F-250 in the middle of the worst snowstorm Denver had seen in 3 years. And I knew right then, this was going to be one of those days that reminded me why I sometimes regretted buying a house in Meadowbrook Estates. I had just gotten home from an emergency judicial conference at the federal courthouse downtown, battling through near whiteout conditions on I-25 for over 2 hours. The entire city was basically shut down, schools closed, businesses sending people home early, and the governor had declared a state of emergency. My driveway was buried under nearly 18 inches of snow, and more was coming down so thick I could barely see across the street. I had pulled my truck onto the street in front of my house, planning to grab my snow blower and clear the driveway before properly parking. The whole process would have taken maybe 20 minutes. I had been inside for exactly 12 minutes. I know because I checked my watch when I walked in, and then again when I heard the diesel engine rumbling outside my window. "Hey, what are you doing?" I called out as I jogged down my front steps, nearly slipping on the accumulating snow. I was still in my suit pants and dress shirt, having only managed to take off my coat and tie. The driver, a heavy-set guy in his 40s with a patchy beard, finally glanced at me. "Got a call for a tow. Silver Ford F-250, this plate number." He held up his phone showing a photo of what was definitely my truck. "That's my truck. I live right here." I pointed at my house, which was literally 15 feet away. "I just pulled up to clear my driveway. This is an emergency snow situation." He shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "Look, man, I just do what I'm told. The HOA called it in, said it was illegally parked. I don't make the rules." "The HOA?" I felt my jaw tighten. "Who specifically?" "Some lady named Patricia. Patricia Winters. She's the president or something." He was working quickly despite the conversation, clearly wanting to finish and get out of there. "She made it real clear this was urgent and I needed to get out here immediately. Offered me double the usual rate because of the weather." Patricia Winters. Of course. The woman had made it her personal mission to enforce every single HOA regulation, like she was running a maximum security prison, instead of a suburban neighborhood association. I had dealt with her notices before for minor things like leaving my trash invisible from the street for an extra day, or parking my truck facing the wrong direction once. But this was a new level of absurdity. During a state of emergency. You're towing vehicles during a declared state of emergency. I could feel my blood pressure rising. That truck is parked in front of my own property. Look around, there are at least 4 other vehicles parked on the street right now. The driver followed my gesture. He was right that there were other cars visible through the snow, all doing exactly what I was doing, waiting out the storm or waiting to clear driveways. "She specifically called about yours, said something about you being a repeat violator, and this was the last straw." A repeat violator. I had gotten 3 notices in the 2 years I lived here. 3. One was the trash can thing. One was because my lawn was allegedly a 1/4 inch too tall. And one was because I had left my boat trailer parked in my driveway for 4 days, which apparently violated some obscure rule about recreational vehicles. "Stop. Don't tow that truck." I tried to keep my voice level. "You're going to unhook it right now. I'm parked in front of my own house during a declared emergency. This is unreasonable and frankly probably illegal." "Look, buddy, I'm not your buddy. And I'm a federal judge for the District of Colorado, so when I tell you this action is likely violating several municipal codes regarding emergency declarations, you might want to listen." That got his attention. His hand stopped moving on the controls. "You're a what, federal judge?" "District Court." I pulled out my wallet and showed him my federal ID and my parking permit, the one that let me park in the secured garage at the Byron White United States Courthouse. The permit had the federal seal and my full credentials listed clearly. Judge Patrick Yates, now unhook my truck. His face went pale. Oh man, oh man, oh man. Look, Judge, I didn't know. The HOA lady, she didn't say anything about it shouldn't matter what I do for a living. This is wrong regardless. But now you know, so unhook it. He was already working the controls in reverse, lowering my truck back down. Yeah, absolutely, Your Honor. I'm so sorry about this. That lady was just really insistent, and with the double pay, I didn't ask enough questions. It's not your fault. Send your bill to Patricia Winters. I watched as my truck settled back onto its wheels. And maybe verify HOA tow requests a little more carefully during emergency weather events. Will do. Definitely will do. He unhooked everything with practice speed and handed me a business card. If you need a statement or anything about this, just call. I'll be happy to explain what happened. I took the card and pocketed it, then watched as he climbed into his tow truck and carefully pulled away down the snow-covered street. My truck sat there, exhaust still wisping from the tailpipe since I had left it running, looking exactly as I had left it 13 minutes ago. I pulled out my phone and took several photos of my truck's position, the street, my house, the snow accumulation, and the time stamp. Then I went inside to change into appropriate clothing for snow removal, my mind already working through the legal and practical implications of what had just happened. Patricia Winters had crossed a line. This was not just petty HOA overreach anymore. She had endangered someone during an emergency weather situation over a parking complaint that had no merit. If that tow truck driver had gotten into an accident rushing out here in these conditions, or if someone had needed emergency services and couldn't get through because of the tow operation, or if I had been stranded without transportation during a legitimate crisis, the liability would have been enormous. But more than the legal implications, this was about power and control. Patricia had been escalating for months, and I had been letting it slide because I was busy with my caseload and honestly did not want to deal with neighborhood drama. Federal judges are supposed to be above that kind of petty conflict. We're meant to be measured, thoughtful, and reluctant to throw our weight around in personal matters. However, there was a difference between being measured and being a doormat. And Patricia needed to understand that HOA regulations, while legally binding in many ways, did not supersede common sense, human decency, or actual law. I changed into jeans, a thick sweater, and my winter boots, then grabbed my heavy coat and gloves. The snow blower was in my garage, and I spent the next 45 minutes clearing my driveway and the path to my front door. The physical work helped me think through my approach to this situation. By the time I had my driveway cleared and my truck properly parked, it was nearly 5 p.m. and the snow was still coming down heavy. My phone had 3 missed calls, all from the same number. I did not recognize it, but when I called back, a woman answered on the first ring. This is Patricia Winters, HOA president of Meadowbrook Estates. Who is this? Her voice was exactly what I expected. Sharp, nasal, with an undertone of constant irritation. I had met her in person exactly twice. Once when I first moved in, and she had come by with a welcome packet that was mostly a list of rules. And once at an HOA meeting I attended about changing the pool hours. She was in her late 40s, always dressed like she was about to attend a business meeting even when checking mailboxes, with blonde hair cut in a severe bob and glasses that she wore on a chain around her neck. This is Patrick Yates. You tried to tow my truck. There was a brief pause. Mr. Yates. Yes. Your vehicle was in violation of the parking regulations outlined in Section 7, subsection 3 of the HOA covenant. Residents are not permitted to park on the street overnight or for extended periods during the day. Your truck had been parked there for over 2 hours. It had been parked there for 12 minutes. I was clearing my driveway during a snowstorm. According to my records, your vehicle was parked on the street at 2:45 p.m. I called the tow company at 4:50 p.m. That's over 2 hours. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. You were watching my house, timing how long my truck was parked. I was performing my duties as HOA president, which includes monitoring compliance with our community standards. Your truck was in violation, and after your previous infractions, I determined that stronger enforcement was necessary. During a declared state of emergency, during a blizzard, you sent a tow truck driver out in dangerous conditions to tow a vehicle that was parked in front of its owner's home while he cleared snow. The weather does not suspend our HOA regulations, Mr. Yates. If we allowed exceptions, the entire system would break down. Rules must be enforced consistently. I had spent 15 years on the bench, and I had heard a lot of rigid, rule-obsessed arguments. This was up there with the worst of them. Patricia, let me be very clear. What you did was dangerous, unreasonable, and likely illegal. You endangered a tow truck driver and wasted emergency resources during a crisis situation. I'm giving you fair warning that if something like this happens again, I will take legal action. Legal action. Her voice went up an octave. Are you threatening me? Because the HOA has every right to enforce its regulations, and if you don't like the rules, you should have read the covenant before purchasing your property. I have a lawyer too, Mr. Yates, and I'm not intimidated by empty threats. They're not empty. And you might want to ask your lawyer about something called unreasonable enforcement and emergency exceptions before you try something like this again. We'll see what the HOA board has to say about your attitude at the next meeting. I'm documenting all of this. Good evening, Mr. Yates. She hung up before I could respond. I stood there in my kitchen, snow melting off my boots onto the tile floor, staring at my phone in disbelief. The woman was either delusional or so drunk on her tiny amount of power that she could not see reason. I made myself dinner, a simple pasta dish, and spent the evening going through the HOA covenant with a legal eye. I had read it before buying the house, of course, but not with the attention I would give to a court document. Now I went through every section, every clause, every piece of fine print. The parking regulation Patricia had cited did exist. Residents were indeed not supposed to park on the street for extended periods without prior approval. However, the definition of extended periods was vague, and there was an entire section about emergency exceptions that Patricia had conveniently ignored. More interesting was a clause about HOA enforcement actions being subject to reasonableness standards, and another about the HOA board being liable for actions taken by the president that exceeded her authority. I made notes, cross-referenced with Colorado HOA law, and started building what was essentially a legal case. Not because I wanted to sue my own neighborhood association, but because I needed to be prepared. Patricia struck me as the type who would double down rather than back down, and this was far from over. The snow continued through the night, and by morning, Denver was buried under almost 2 feet. The federal courthouse was closed. Only emergency personnel were supposed to be on the roads, and the entire city was in that weird, quiet state that comes after a major storm. I spent the morning working from home, reviewing briefs for upcoming cases, and watching out my window as neighbors gradually emerged to begin the massive dig-out process. Around noon, My doorbell rang. I opened it to find a woman in her 60s standing there, bundled in a purple parka with a matching scarf. I recognized her as Helen Marquez, who lived 3 houses down and had always been friendly in passing. "Patrick, right? I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all. Come in, please." "You must be freezing." She stomped snow off her boots and stepped into my entryway. "I won't keep you long. I just wanted to give you a heads up about something. Patricia has been calling around the neighborhood this morning. She's telling people that you threatened her yesterday and that you're trying to intimidate the HOA board." I should have expected this. "That's not accurate. I told her that trying to tow my truck during an emergency was unreasonable and potentially illegal." I figured it was something like that. Patricia has a way of spinning things. Helen pulled off her gloves. "Look, I've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years. I was here before Patricia became HOA president 3 years ago. She's gotten progressively worse, more controlling, more rigid about every little rule. A lot of us are pretty fed up, but she's got 2 allies on the 5-person board who back everything she does, so we're stuck in a 3-2 vote situation on every issue. Why hasn't anyone voted her out? We've tried. But she controls the proxy votes, somehow always manages to get people on her side, and makes it very difficult for anyone else to run against her. Last election, she was the only candidate because she made it so unpleasant for the other person who wanted to run that they dropped out. This was sounding more and more like a dictatorship than a homeowners association. What about getting enough homeowners together to force a special election or change the bylaws? We'd need 60% of the homeowners to call for that. Getting 60% of people to agree on anything is nearly impossible, and Patricia is very good at dividing people. She does favors for some, overlooks violations for her friends, and strictly enforces everything against people she doesn't like. It creates this atmosphere where nobody wants to rock the boat too much. I nodded, understanding the dynamic. It was classic authoritarian behavior just playing out on a neighborhood scale. "What do you think I should do?" "Honestly, keep documentation of everything." "I have a feeling Patricia is going to make your life difficult now that you've pushed back. She doesn't like being challenged. But I wanted you to know that there are a lot of us who would support you if you decide to fight back against her overreach. We're just not in a position to do it ourselves." After Helen left, I made a call to my clerk at the courthouse, Marcus, and asked him to do some research on Colorado HOA law and recent cases involving HOA overreach. Marcus was a sharp recent law school graduate who loved digging into research, and he seemed almost excited about the project despite the courthouse being closed. The rest of the day was quiet. The snow finally stopped around 3 p.m., and the city began the slow process of digging itself out. I spent time clearing the sidewalk in front of my house and helping an elderly neighbor, Mr. Sato, with his driveway. That evening, I got an email from the HOA. It was a formal notice of violation, citing me for threatening and intimidating behavior toward an HOA board member, and informing me that I was being fined $500. The email was CC'd to the entire HOA board and included a request for a hearing to determine if additional sanctions should be imposed. I read the email 3 times, each time feeling my anger rising. This was retaliation, pure and simple. Patricia was trying to punish me for standing up to her, and she was doing it through official HOA channels to give it a veneer of legitimacy. I drafted a response, carefully worded but firm. I denied the accusations, provided a factual account of what had happened with the tow truck, noted the emergency weather conditions, and requested that the fine be rescinded. I pointed out that I had made no threats, had simply informed her of potential legal issues with her actions, and that characterizing that as intimidation was inaccurate and itself a form of retaliation. I CC'd my response to the entire HOA board and sent it before I could second-guess myself. Then I poured myself a bourbon and tried to relax, though my mind kept running through legal strategies and potential outcomes. The next day, the courthouse reopened, and I drove in through streets that were still narrowed by piled snow. My first case of the day was a civil matter involving a contract dispute, and I was grateful for the distraction of legal arguments that had nothing to do with my personal situation. During my lunch break, Marcus came to my chambers with a folder full of research. Judge Yates, this is fascinating stuff. Colorado has some of the stronger HOA regulations in the country, but there have been several recent cases that have limited HOA authority, especially regarding unreasonable enforcement and emergency situations. He walked me through 3 cases that were directly relevant. In one, an HOA had been found liable for damages after towing a vehicle during a medical emergency. In another, a Colorado appeals court had ruled that HOA parking regulations could not be enforced in ways that contradicted municipal emergency declarations. The third case involved an HOA president who had been personally sued for harassment after targeting specific homeowners with excessive fines. This is good work, Marcus. Very thorough. There's more, Judge. I also looked up Meadowbrook Estates specifically. Your HOA has been involved in 3 lawsuits in the past 5 years. 2 were settled out of court, and 1 went to judgment against the HOA for selective enforcement of regulations. All 3 cases were during Patricia Winters' tenure as president. That was enlightening. Patricia had a track record of pushing things too far. Can you get me the case files on those? Already pulled them. He handed me another folder. The one that went to judgment is particularly interesting. The homeowner successfully argued that the HOA was targeting them based on personal animosity, and the judge awarded damages plus attorney's fees. The homeowner ended up moving anyway, said they couldn't live in the neighborhood anymore after the conflict. I spent my afternoon break reading through the case files. The pattern was clear. Patricia found someone she did not like, usually for some petty reason, and then began documenting every possible violation, issuing fines, and making their lives miserable until they either capitulated completely or moved away. The homeowner who had won in court had been through nearly 2 years of harassment before finally suing. That evening, I got 3 emails from members of the HOA board. The first was from Donald Chen, who I had met briefly at the pool meeting. He thanked me for my response and said he found the towing incident concerning and would be voting against the fine. The second was from Maria Santos, who said she wanted to hear both sides before making a decision and proposed a meeting with me and Patricia present. The third was from Barbara Lynn, one of Patricia's allies. It was curt and condescending, informing me that the HOA had the authority to enforce its regulations as it saw fit, and that my attempt to use your position as a judge to intimidate the board would not be successful. She emphasized that she fully supported Patricia's actions and would be voting to uphold the fine. That last email bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I had been very careful not to use my position as a judge to throw weight around. I had mentioned it to the tow truck driver only because he was already in the process of doing something questionable, and it was relevant to show him I understood the legal implications. But now, Patricia was apparently spinning it as if I was abusing my authority. I needed to be even more careful going forward. Judges are held to high ethical standards, and while I was well within my rights to defend myself from unreasonable HOA actions, I could not be seen as using my judicial position for personal advantage. It was a fine line to walk. The HOA hearing was scheduled for the following Wednesday evening at the community center. I spent the weekend preparing, treating it like I would any other legal proceeding. I gathered documentation, prepared a timeline, organized my evidence, and drafted a statement. I also reached out to the tow truck driver, who agreed to provide a written statement about the circumstances of the call. On Monday, I got a call from my colleague, Judge Rebecca Morrison, who lived about 10 miles away. "Patrick, I heard through the grapevine you're having HOA issues." "What's going on?" I explained the situation, and she listened with what sounded like sympathetic frustration. "Oh, Patrick, this is exactly why Sarah and I bought a house in a neighborhood without an HOA. These things can get so messy." "I'm realizing that. Did you call just to say I told you so?" She laughed. "No, I called because I dealt with something similar about 5 years ago at our old house. Different HOA, different state, but same kind of power-hungry president. The thing that finally resolved it was getting enough homeowners to show up at the meeting to force a vote of no confidence. It took organizing and effort, but once the other homeowners saw that someone was willing to stand up and that they wouldn't be alone, it changed the dynamic. Helen, one of my neighbors, mentioned something similar, but she said getting people to act was difficult because Patricia has divided everyone. That's the tactic. But here's the thing, Patrick. You have credibility that the average homeowner doesn't. You're a federal judge. People will listen to you, and Patricia can't easily dismiss you or intimidate you the way she might someone else. You're in a unique position to actually change things if you want to. I'm not sure I want to become the leader of some HOA resistance movement, Rebecca. I just want to park my truck and live my life. I get that. But sometimes these things choose us. Think about it. The conversation stuck with me. I had always been someone who believed in systems, in the rule of law, in established processes. But those systems only worked when the people operating them acted in good faith. Patricia was not acting in good faith. She was abusing her position, and if I just dealt with this one incident and moved on, she would continue to abuse it with others. On Tuesday evening, Helen knocked on my door again. This time she had 2 other neighbors with her, Tom and Jennifer Aldrich from across the street. "We heard about the hearing tomorrow. We want to come and speak on your behalf." I invited them in and made coffee. We sat in my living room as they told me their own stories of Patricia's overreach. Tom had been fined repeatedly for having a basketball hoop in his driveway, which Patricia claimed was unsightly, even though it was a simple portable hoop that their kids used, and that was moved into the garage at night. Jennifer had been cited for having the wrong color curtains visible from the street, an aesthetic violation that she had not even known existed in the regulations. "She drives through the neighborhood multiple times a day," Tom said, "just looking for violations. It's like living under surveillance. Our kids are scared to play outside because they don't want to accidentally break some rule." "That's not how a community should function," I said. "An HOA is supposed to maintain property values and provide shared services, not control every aspect of how people live." "Exactly," Jennifer said. "But try telling that to Patricia. She thinks she owns the neighborhood. And the worst part is that half the board just goes along with whatever she says because it's easier than fighting her." We talked for over an hour, and by the end, I had committed to not just defending myself at the hearing, but to pushing for broader changes to how the HOA operated. It was not what I had planned, and it would take time and energy I did not really have to spare, but Rebecca was right. This had chosen me, and I was in a position to actually make a difference. Wednesday arrived cold but clear. The snow from the previous week mostly melted except for piles in shaded areas. I left work at 4 to prepare for the 7 p.m. hearing, changing into casual clothes because I wanted to be taken seriously, but not appear as if I was trying to intimidate anyone with formality. The community center was a modest building with a meeting room that held about 50 people. When I arrived at 6:45, there were already about 20 people there, more than I had expected. Helen waved me over to a seat she had saved, and I recognized several faces from around the neighborhood. Patricia sat at a table at the front of the room with the 4 other board members. She wore a navy suit and her glasses on a chain, looking every bit the part of someone who took her HOA presidency very seriously. When she saw me, her expression hardened, and she leaned over to whisper something to Barbara Lynn, who sat next to her. The meeting started promptly at 7. Patricia called the meeting to order and went through some routine business first: approvals of previous minutes, a report on the HOA's finances, and a discussion about scheduling spring landscaping for the common areas. It was all very procedural and boring, and I could tell she was deliberately making people wait for the main event. Finally, at 7:35, she moved to what she called disciplinary matters. She presented the case against me in a tone that made it sound like I had committed a serious crime. According to her version, I had verbally assaulted her over the phone, threatened her with frivolous legal action, attempted to use my position as a judge to intimidate her, and demonstrated a pattern of disrespect for HOA regulations that warranted significant fines and sanctions. When she finished, she looked at me expectantly. "Mr. Yates, you have the opportunity to respond." I stood up and walked to the front of the room, carrying the folder I had prepared. "Thank you, Patricia. First, I want to provide the board and everyone here with the actual facts of what happened, which differ significantly from what you just described." I walked through the timeline methodically. The snowstorm, the declared state of emergency, my arrival home after fighting through dangerous conditions, my 12-minute absence while I changed clothes to clear my driveway, the appearance of the tow truck. I handed out copies of the photos I had taken, the statement from the tow truck driver, and a printout of the state emergency declaration that had been in effect. At no point did I threaten Miss Winters, I continued. I informed her that her action was unreasonable and potentially illegal, which is a factual statement, not a threat. I have the phone record showing that she called me 3 times before I returned her call, and that our conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. During that conversation, she was dismissive of the emergency conditions and insisted that rules must be enforced consistently, even during a blizzard. I looked at each board member in turn. The HOA covenant, which I have now read very carefully, includes several provisions about emergency exceptions and reasonableness in enforcement. Section 14, paragraph 2 specifically states that enforcement of regulations shall be subject to reasonableness standards and shall account for emergency conditions beyond homeowners' control. The state emergency declaration qualifies as exactly such a condition. Donald Chen was nodding. Maria Santos was taking notes. Barbara Lynn looked unmoved, and the 5th board member, a younger man named Keith Preston, who I did not know well, looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. As for my position as a judge, I mentioned it to the tow truck driver because he was actively engaged in an action that appeared to violate municipal codes regarding emergency operations, and I wanted him to understand the seriousness of what was happening. I have not used my position to intimidate anyone, and I resent the implication that defending myself from unreasonable treatment somehow constitutes abuse of authority. Patricia's face had gone red. "You're twisting the facts, Mr. Yates. I'm not finished, I said firmly. I also want the board to understand that this is not just about my situation. I have spoken with numerous neighbors over the past week who have experienced similar overreach. The HOA exists to serve the homeowners, not to control them. There needs to be a serious discussion about how regulations are being enforced and whether the current approach is creating a positive community or a hostile one. I handed out copies of the case Law Marcus had researched, including the previous lawsuit against our HOA. This information is for the board's reference. I hope we can resolve this reasonably and use it as an opportunity to improve how our HOA operates. However, if this continues to be handled punitively and unfairly, I am prepared to take whatever legal action is necessary to protect my rights as a homeowner. I sat down. The room was silent for a moment, and then Tom Aldrich stood up. I'd like to speak if I can. I support what Patrick just said. My family has also been subjected to excessive enforcement over minor issues. We moved to this neighborhood because we thought it would be a good community to raise our kids, but instead it feels like we're constantly being watched and criticized. Helen stood next. I've lived here for 12 years, and I can tell you that this HOA has changed dramatically under the current leadership. It used to be a community where neighbors helped each other, and the HOA handled practical matters. Now it feels adversarial. That needs to change. 3 more people spoke, all echoing similar concerns. Patricia tried to interrupt several times, but Donald Chen actually told her to let people speak, which seemed to surprise her. Finally, Maria Santos said, I think we need to table the fine against Mr. Yates and have a broader discussion about our enforcement policies. This is clearly about more than one parking incident. I second that, Donald said immediately. Barbara Lynn objected. We can't just ignore violations because people complain. If we don't enforce the rules, property values will decline. There's a difference between enforcement and harassment, Keith Preston said quietly. He had been silent the whole meeting, but now he looked directly at Patricia. I voted for you because I thought you'd do a good job, but I'm not comfortable with how this has been handled. I think we need to vote down this fine. Patricia looked betrayed. Keith, you can't be serious. We've always been aligned on these issues. I've been going along to avoid conflict, Keith said. But this is different. Trying to tow someone's vehicle during a blizzard, that's not reasonable no matter how you frame it. I'm voting no on the fine. The vote was 4-1 against the fine, with only Barbara Lynn voting to uphold it. Patricia looked furious but had to accept the result. The meeting moved to other business, but there was a palpable shift in the room. People were talking in small groups, energized by what had happened. After the meeting officially ended, at least a dozen people came up to me to thank me for speaking up. One man, George Franklin, who lived at the far end of the neighborhood, said, "You know what we should do? We should recall Patricia as president." I looked into it once. We need 40% of homeowners to sign a petition calling for a special election, and then we have a vote. If the majority votes for recall, she's out and we elect someone new. That seems extreme, I said, though privately I thought it might be necessary. It's not extreme when the president is abusing their authority, George said. I've been here since this development was built and I've never seen anything like her tenure. She needs to go. Helen joined the conversation. George is right. We tried to work with her, we tried to moderate her, but she just doubles down every time. The only solution is to replace her. Over the next hour, more than 20 homeowners stayed at the community center, talking about next steps. I found myself somehow at the center of it, not because I was trying to lead, but because people kept asking me questions and looking to me for guidance. By the end of the evening, We had formed a loose coalition with the goal of gathering signatures for a recall petition. I drove home exhausted but also feeling something I had not expected. Hope, maybe even excitement. I had spent my career adjudicating conflicts, interpreting law, maintaining impartiality. This was different. This was being part of a community, standing up for what was right not from behind a bench, but as a participant. It was uncomfortable and messy and surprisingly energizing. Over the next 2 weeks, the recall effort gained momentum. George created the petition based on the HOA bylaws, and we set up a simple online spreadsheet to coordinate who would talk to which homeowners. People went door to door in the evenings and on weekends, explaining the situation and asking for signatures. Patricia did not take this lying down. She sent out multiple emails to all homeowners, characterizing the recall effort as a personal attack led by me because I was angry about being held accountable for violations. She accused us of trying to destroy the HOA and eliminate all rules, turning the neighborhood into a chaotic free-for-all. She held a meeting for her supporters, about 15 people who liked her strict enforcement or who were friends of hers, and they started their own counter-campaign. The neighborhood became divided. There were heated conversations at the mailboxes, arguments at the community pool, and even a confrontation in the parking lot of the nearby grocery store between two neighbors on opposite sides. It was unpleasant and stressful, and more than once I questioned whether I had made the right choice getting involved, but the signatures kept coming. Helen reported getting 8 in one evening. Tom and Jennifer got 12 between them over a weekend. George, who seemed to have limitless energy for this, talked to over 30 homeowners personally. I contributed where I could, though I was careful about how I approached people, not wanting to be seen as using my position improperly. 3 weeks after the hearing, we had the required 40%. George filed the petition with the HOA board, and according to the bylaws, they had to call a special election within 30 days. Patricia tried to challenge the petition's validity. She claimed some signatures were improperly collected, that some people who signed were not actually homeowners of record, and that the petition did not meet the technical requirements of the bylaws. Donald Chen, who it turned out had some legal background himself, reviewed her objections and found them without merit. The board voted 3-2, with Keith joining Donald and Maria, to accept the petition and schedule the election. The campaign period was intense. Patricia painted herself as a defender of property values and community standards under attack from entitled homeowners who did not want to follow rules. Our coalition, which we called Neighbors for Reasonable Governance, focused on messages about community, proportionality, and accountability. I was nominated to run against Patricia for HOA president, which I initially resisted. I did not want to be HOA president. I barely wanted to deal with HOA business at all. But Helen, George, and others convinced me that we needed a credible alternative candidate, someone people trusted, and who could not be easily dismissed. So I found myself running for HOA president of Meadowbrook Estates, which was not something I had ever imagined doing. I created a simple platform built on transparency, reasonable enforcement, and community building. I promised to establish clear guidelines for what constituted violations, create an appeals process for fines, and refocus the HOA on maintaining shared spaces and organizing community events, rather than policing every minor infraction. The election was held on a Saturday in mid-March at the community center. We had record turnout, over 75% of homeowners either attending in person or submitting absentee ballots. The atmosphere was tense, people clustered in groups, mostly civil but with an undercurrent of hostility between the two camps. When the votes were counted, I won with 62%. Patricia got 35%, and there were a few write-in votes for other people. It was decisive, a clear message that the majority of homeowners wanted change. Patricia's reaction was not graceful. She stood up when the results were announced and said, "This neighborhood is going to regret this. Without proper enforcement, property values will decline, standards will fall, and Meadowbrook Estates will become just another run-down suburb." I wash my hands of it. Then she left, Barbara Lynn following her. I gave a brief speech thanking people for their participation and promising to do my best to serve the community fairly. I meant it, though I also felt overwhelmed by what I had just taken on. The transition was rocky. Patricia was supposed to turn over all HOA records, financial documents, and keys to shared facilities within 7 days according to the bylaws. Instead, she went silent. She did not respond to emails, did not answer calls, and did not turn anything over. After 10 days, I consulted with the HOA's attorney, a lawyer named Richard Kim, who had represented the HOA in routine matters for years. He sent Patricia a formal demand letter, stating that failure to turn over HOA property constituted a breach of fiduciary duty and potentially conversion of HOA assets. That got a response, but not the one we wanted. Patricia's personal attorney sent back a letter claiming that she needed time to organize the records and that we were harassing her. It also made vague allegations about irregularities in the election, though it did not specify what those were. Richard advised that we could sue, but that it would be expensive and time-consuming. Instead, he suggested we file a complaint with the Colorado HOA Regulatory Agency, which had authority to investigate HOA disputes and could impose penalties for officers who failed to fulfill their duties. We filed the complaint, providing documentation of the election, the bylaws regarding transition of authority, and the timeline of Patricia's refusal to cooperate. Within a week, an investigator contacted both Patricia and me to gather information. Meanwhile, I was trying to actually run the HOA without access to most of the records. Donald Chen, who remained on the board in his role as treasurer, had separate access to the bank accounts, so we could at least handle financial matters. Maria Santos helped me start reconstructing information by reaching out to vendors and service providers. It was a mess, but we made it work. The real bombshell came 3 weeks later when the state investigator contacted me. "Judge Yates, I need to inform you that our investigation has revealed some concerning financial discrepancies in the HOA accounts. The previous president appears to have made several unauthorized expenditures over the past 2 years, totaling approximately $38,000. I felt my stomach drop. Unauthorized how? Payments to various vendors and service providers that don't appear in the official HOA budget or meeting minutes. Some of the vendors don't seem to exist when we try to verify them. We're referring this to the district attorney's office for potential criminal investigation." This was not what I had signed up for. I had thought this was about an overzealous HOA president enforcing rules too strictly. Now it appeared Patricia had been embezzling HOA funds. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings with investigators, attorneys, and concerned homeowners. Patricia was officially notified that she was under criminal investigation for theft and fraud. Her attorney issued a statement denying any wrongdoing and claiming that all expenditures were legitimate HOA business expenses. The district attorney's office moved quickly. They obtained warrants for Patricia's personal financial records and the HOA records she had finally been forced to turn over. An audit revealed that she had created several shell vendor companies, billed the HOA for services that were never performed, and deposited the money into accounts she controlled. She had been doing this for over 2 years, skimming money in amounts small enough that they did not raise immediate red flags, but which added up to significant theft. She was arrested in early May on multiple felony counts, including theft, fraud, and abuse of fiduciary duty. The arrest made the local news, and several reporters contacted me for comment. I declined to speak in detail, only confirming that irregularities had been discovered and that I was cooperating with law enforcement. Patricia posted bail and was released pending trial. Her attorney negotiated with the DA's office, and eventually, she agreed to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for full restitution to the HOA, 3 years probation, and community service. The judge in her criminal case, ironically one of my colleagues in the state court system though not the federal court, made it clear during sentencing that prison time had been seriously considered and that she was fortunate to avoid it. Miss Winters, you were given a position of trust within your community, and you systematically abused that trust for personal gain. Judge David Kowalski said during the sentencing hearing, which I attended. You stole from your neighbors, people who relied on you to manage their shared resources honestly. That you did this while simultaneously enforcing petty regulations against those same neighbors shows a particular kind of arrogance and hypocrisy. You're fortunate the prosecution agreed to this plea agreement, but understand that any violation of your probation will result in immediate incarceration. Patricia stood there looking diminished and bitter, a far cry from the imperious HOA president who had tried to tow my truck during a blizzard 7 months earlier. When she was asked if she had anything to say, she gave a brief statement apologizing to the community and claiming she had made mistakes during a difficult time in her life. It rang hollow, but at least it was over. The HOA received full restitution, though it took months for all the money to be recovered. We used part of it to hire a professional management company to handle day-to-day operations, which freed up the board to focus on policy rather than minutiae. We revised the enforcement procedures to require warnings before fines, established an appeals process, and created clear standards for what constituted violations. More importantly, the neighborhood began to feel like a community again. We organized a summer block party, started a neighborhood watch program that was actually about neighbors helping each other rather than spying, and people generally seemed less stressed and more friendly. I served as HOA president for 1 year, then stepped down in favor of Helen, who was elected unanimously. I remained on the board as a regular member, which was about the right level of involvement for me. The whole experience had taught me something valuable about the difference between law and justice, between authority and leadership, and between enforcing rules and building community. My truck never got towed again, though I did get one polite note from Helen after I left it parked on the street for 3 days while I was traveling for a judicial conference. The note said, "Patrick, just wanted to let you know your truck has been on the street for a bit. Wanted to make sure everything is okay and you didn't need any help with anything. Welcome home when you get back." That was how an HOA was supposed to work. Looking back, the whole situation that started on that snowy February afternoon seemed almost surreal. A simple incident of a woman drunk on a tiny amount of power had spiraled into uncovering fraud, criminal prosecution, and ultimately transforming how our neighborhood operated. If I had not pushed back that day when the tow truck came, if I had just let it go and paid whatever fines Patricia imposed, none of that would have happened. She would have continued her petty tyranny and her embezzlement, and the neighborhood would have remained a place where people felt surveilled and attacked rather than supported. Sometimes standing up for yourself when something is wrong leads to changes you never expected. Sometimes the smallest incidents reveal larger problems. And sometimes a federal judge who just wants to park his truck and clear his driveway ends up becoming the person who brings down a corrupt HOA president and helps build a real community in the process. The following spring, almost exactly a year after Patricia's sentencing, I was sitting on my front porch on a beautiful April morning, drinking coffee and watching neighbors walking their dogs and kids riding bikes. My truck was parked in my driveway, properly and without concern. Tom Aldrich's kids were playing basketball across the street, the hoop set up in their driveway just like it should be. Helen walked by with her golden retriever and waved. George drove past in his classic car that had previously been a source of HOA violations because Patricia thought it was unsightly, honking and giving me a thumbs up. It was peaceful. It was what a neighborhood should be. And while I would never have chosen to go through the stress and conflict of the previous year, I was grateful for how it had turned out. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, something about a case we were working on at the courthouse. I finished my coffee, took one more look at the quiet street, and headed inside to get ready for work. Just another federal judge living in suburban Denver, dealing with the complexities of the law and the simpler pleasure of being part of a community that actually functioned the way it was supposed to. The HOA drama was behind me. Patricia was fulfilling her probation requirements, and Meadowbrook Estates had become what it always should have been, a place where neighbors looked out for each other instead of looking for violations. Sometimes justice comes from the bench, and sometimes it comes from simply refusing to accept unreasonable treatment and being willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's inconvenient and messy. That snowy day when I saw that tow truck hooking up my Ford had taught me that lesson in a way no case ever had, and I was better for it.